Evidence suggests that we're now actually starting to curve downwards, so we need to correct that. Now, where does insulin resistance come from? The simple story of where this most common of all chronic disorders comes from is that it is a result of too much insulin. That sounds a little counterintuitive, but it is a reflection of a fundamental biological principle. Too much of a stimulus will result in a resistance to that stimulus. Once upon a time, 1 cup of coffee was enough to get you going. Now you need 10, for an individual, perhaps. Why are we so judicious with the use of certain drugs and antibiotics? Because the thing will become resistant to it. So too much insulin in the body, this humble little hormone, this petite little peptide, too much of it will start to tell the body to stop responding to it. That is insulin resistance. That's where it comes from. Too much insulin. So then the next question that your friend may ask you as you teach them this is, well, where does all the insulin come from? Why is the insulin high in the first place? The main trigger of insulin is blood sugar. When blood glucose levels start to rise, that's to a point fine. As it gets higher, it becomes problematic and harmful. So in this regard, insulin acts like a hero. Insulin, the pancreas under the stomach, is sensing this big increase in blood sugar and says, red alert, I know what to do. I'm going to lower the blood sugar. And so insulin will go through the body, kind of escorting glucose and dropping it off at various cells. That's fine. But suffice it to say, the more we are pushing the blood sugar up, what's happening to insulin? The more the insulin is getting pushed up. And so we have to address that root, that origin of the problem. So what is, in my estimation as a metabolic scientist, the metabolic problem that is putting us into these plagues of prosperity driven by insulin resistance? There are 2 essential things. There's 2 problems, and they will become part of the solution as you discuss it with your friends. Firstly, we live in a culture, and I don't just mean North America, of constant carbohydrate consumption. This is a global phenomenon. At the same time, we simply eat all the time. In fact, we've been told to do this. How many of you have been told we need to be eating 5 or 6 little meals a day? It is a perfect way. Rob talked about a perfect storm. Talk about a perfect storm to just make you fat and sick and make you dependent on drugs to try to mask the symptoms of what your lifestyle is causing. So let's look at the carbohydrate consumption. Now, some of you may think, well, Ben, why are you just pointing the finger at carbs? There are, after all, other macronutrients that humans eat. Why not focus or point the finger at protein? Why not focus on fat? It's because we're not eating too much protein and fat. 70% of all calories consumed globally come from carbohydrates. So this is a global metric. And I want you to appreciate the global aspect of this. One of the things in North America, particularly in the US, I like to joke that no one thinks America is as bad as an American does, although Canadians may. Mind you, I'm a Canadian by birth, born and raised in Alberta, just so you know. So thanks for inviting me home. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be back. It's fun to hear the Canadian accent as it's slowly been weaved out of my own vocabulary or diction. So this is a global problem. You go to the Middle East, go to Oman and Dubai, and they eat more carbs than we do. Go to even Singapore, one of my beloved countries, they eat more carbs than we do. This is a global issue. So not only are carbs the most common thing we're eating, but it is also the one macronutrient that tragically has the biggest effect on insulin because it directly turns into blood sugar. Right? That's not very confusing. It's very clear. So if a human eats pure fat, there's no insulin response. Not that you would want to do that. Although, Rob, can I tell one of my favorite habits? No. When I wake up early in the morning, I am of the mind that Dad should be the first one awake. I'm up very early. I put on my weighted vest and my dumbbells, and I hike 1 mile up a hill, listening to scriptures. I'm very religious. And then 1 mile back down, I listen to something that helps me be just better. And then I do my 100 push-ups, then I get into an ice bath, and then I make a hot cup of Unamate, and back to my point, because I promise I didn't forget it, I put a big dab of butter in it. Isn't that crazy? It satisfies my appetite so thoroughly that as much as I'm a wrinkled, freckled, bald man, my wife has no complaints about my six-pack. So I swear, there's something to it. There's something to it. So, protein and fat have little to no effect on insulin. So let's focus on the one that does, and that's why, again, I'm pointing the finger at carbohydrates. And this is what it looks like for the average person. We wake up in the morning, finally, in a hint of a fasted state. Now, how does a metabolic scientist define fasting? Insulin. Insulin is the hormone that determines whether your body is acting as if it's in a fed state, meaning I'm going to store energy away, or whether it's in a fasted state, meaning I'm going to be using my energy and mobilizing it. Insulin determines the fed or the fasted state. So finally, we haven't eaten in several hours, and our insulin has come down. Thus, we have entered the fasted state. But what does the average person do? They then begin this roller coaster of hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia that lasts for the entire day. And before they are ever giving their body a chance to let the insulin come down, they've spiked it back up again, because we live in a culture that is consumed by carbohydrates and we feast too frequently. So the solution is to flip these variables around a little bit. If we are chronically or constantly consuming carbohydrates, we need to control them. If we are feasting too frequently, we need to develop a metabolic rigor or resilience that can be capable of fasting more frequently. Now, how can we do that? I appreciate that my endocrinologist physician friend, wasn't she just lovely? That you had said how hard it was for you to control carbohydrates. That's not surprising, because when humans crave something, it's not fat. No human ever sits down on a Saturday night and turns on a movie and says, oh, I sure could just eat a stick of butter right now. No one. At the same time, no one is thinking, I need some whey protein, and they're gonna make a line of protein and snort it up or something. No one is craving protein. What do we crave? Think about it. You want something that is salty and crunchy or sweet and gooey. That means carbohydrate, and indeed the evidence, I am a scientist after all, supports it. That in all of the neurobiology of addiction, humans only show addictive tendencies toward one class of macronutrient, carbohydrates. So as you talk about this with your friend, you say you need to control your carbs. They will say, I know, and I've known that probably intuitively for years, but I can't do it. You need to have tools to help them. One way to help them is to teach them about the principles of biology or physiology, the systems, which is to say that if the mouth tastes something bitter, even if you don't feel it as bitter, if it's a bitter tastant, that is a class of a food or a substance in what we eat. Bitter tastants have the ability to tell the brain, you actually don't need that sweet thing. It can turn that down, that noise that is yelling at you to go and eat this sugary, starchy thing. Something bitter will help turn that down. Now your friend will say, well, how can I get some? Well, you can teach them about the bitter tastant properties of two molecules, theobromine and saponins. Then they would say, well, where do I get it from? You say, I have a really, really good source, and that would be Unimate. You may notice that there's a particular mouth feel to Unimate. Now, it's sweetened in a way to help mask some of the bitterness, but this is a food supplement that has bitter molecules in them. Don't apologize for them. I remember the very first Unicity meeting I ever attended and presented at. I was invited to speak at a meeting in Singapore. That was when Unimate was released. I would hear people kind of apologizing for the bitter taste. And I thought, no, lean into it. It is by design, because that bitter mouthfeel will tell the brain it's time to turn off. In fact, it even goes beyond the brain, that these bitter tastant molecules get tasted, as you can see in this study here, not only by cells further down in our gut, but even our fat cells taste those molecules, all of which are working together to send a signal to the brain to say, don't eat that sweet thing. So when you start to try to control cravings, you want some help, because it could be, in many instances, a true addiction. Let's treat it as such. Now also, You're not done helping your friend when you're talking about cravings with them. Teach them about these things called short-chain fatty acids. I'm a great defender of fat. I believe one of the greatest things that went wrong in human nutrition was vilifying fat, something we literally need to eat. In fact, some of the most prominent theories of human evolution, however humans came to be how we are, and no one knows, it's all theoretical. The whole idea of evolution is completely theoretical. That's a deeper conversation for another time, I know. But one of the leading theories is something called the expensive tissue hypothesis. The long and short of it is, basically humans began eating fattier foods, which allowed the brain to get really big and really developed. And it allowed the intestines to shrink a lot. So I'm a great defender of fat, which brings me back to this point about short-chain fatty acids. We don't get a lot of these in our diet because we don't eat a lot of fermented foods, but we also don't eat a lot of fiber. And short-chain fatty acids are made from the microbiome when it eats fiber. So we eat fiber, but it doesn't give us any direct nutritional value. We don't metabolize fiber as humans, but our bacteria within our intestines do. They will consume that fiber and then produce short-chain fats, which we then absorb, and we're glad to do it because short-chain fatty acids are another signal to help control cravings, and you have a way to give your friend some of the best or the best designed soluble fiber they can get. All right, so this is still helping your friend be educated and know how to improve their metabolic health. We've heard a mention of a couple other things, and so there are two other points I wanted to make. And I wanted to initially frame this, in fact, in the case of drugs, exclusively frame it in the context of a humble little hormone, another one called GLP-1. Have you all heard of GLP-1?
Yeah.
So GLP-1 is a hormone that is produced in the body, and it is a good one. It is a metabolic companion to help us have improved health. So we want to take advantage of GLP-1. We make it from our intestines, and I'm going to focus on this a little more in a minute. But some of the main mechanisms of action of GLP-1, what does this hormone do in the body? It will tell the stomach and intestines to slow down so that when you eat, you're going to feel fuller for longer. And it will also tell the brain that we're full. It will activate satiety centers within the brain. So the collective effect of this is going to be that we just simply feel full. And that's going to help us eat less, of course. Now, I just added this, and the team here, Ashley was such a good support here. I literally just added this study right before I came down, and they updated this because I wanted to share with you how relevant GLP-1 is. Lest it seem like I'm attacking GLP-1, I actually think there's tremendous opportunity for you to talk about this and to be quite empathetic with your friend or family member. So this was a study, here's the title, you can look it up. They had humans split into two groups, a lean group of humans and humans who struggle with obesity. Then they had them eat fat, and then they measured their GLP-1. And they found that GLP-1 levels were roughly the same in the lean and obese groups. So in other words, whether the individual struggled with obesity or did not, they would eat fat and both have an equal degree of satiety. So both of them could push that fat away pretty easily and say, I'm done. But that's not going to be hard with pure fat, right? Where it gets harder is when they gave the people pure carbohydrate. Look at the difference. When the lean people had a GLP-1 response that went over 2 times higher than the obese group did. This suggests that someone who struggles with obesity could be someone who, when they eat carbohydrate, they have an insufficient GLP-1 response. So in other words, they're going to eat that same amount of carbohydrate as their lean counterpart and still want more. Because GLP-1 isn't telling them that they've had enough. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that well? So one thing for you to talk about is to help your friend learn to take advantage of it the right way. Now, before I get to that, although now that I've transitioned, I should have paced this differently. There's a wrong way, in my view, which is to try to dial GLP-1 up to an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. That's what these drugs are doing. The modern use of these so-called weight loss drugs, although I remember them when they were just diabetes drugs. My PhD lab was one of the first funded labs in the US to work on this class of drug. So I have kept my finger on the pulse of these since their beginning. Now, these drugs take it too far, if you will, and this is why I say that. I've mentioned that GLP-1 slows down the intestines. In fact, these drugs may do it so well that it slows them down too much. And these are actual cases of people dying because the intestines stopped. They paralyze because of the excess slowing signal. But even less severe than that, people on these drugs will get something that we just sort of colloquially call Ozempic burps, which is a result of the food sitting. Normally food will sit in the stomach for 4 to 5 hours. It sits there for over 20 hours. And it starts to almost fester, and they're getting these little noxious fumes bubbling up their esophagus. And so they're burping, and it's stinky because they have food that won't move. That's a consideration that most people don't know. One that matters to me, and those of us that were up trying to show off our push-ups, is that there's evidence to show that these drugs have a direct effect on fat-free mass or lean mass. This paper, published in one of the best journals on the planet in the realm of medical research, found that up to 40% of weight that people are losing is coming from fat-free mass. This means it's stripping your muscle and bones. This is a message that I am so eager to announce and proclaim, because as much as these drugs are starting to be used, I would say in a way to mask eating disorders, you see relatively thin women who are developing a bone health. Like this would be a young, lean gal in her 20s who gets on the drug because she wants to be even thinner than she is, and then she has the bones of an 80-year-old by the time she gets off 1 year later. So this is accelerating osteoporosis. Now, one of the main reasons the person gets on it is to help control their cravings. So what happens to cravings? This study was sobering. Now please remember, the reason I'm showing you this is because I want you to so internalize it and understand it that you can talk about this later. Don't forget. So don't be a passive student. I'm used to students just looking at me, mouth breathing the whole time. Where I'm trying to compete with them against Instagram or social media. You are more interested and eager. I'm not used to having anyone clap for me. This is wonderful. But don't just learn. You should be actively thinking, how can I talk about this? Am I understanding this concept well enough that Ben is teaching that I can go talk about it? This one matters. This study is sobering because what they found was remarkable. They had these people stay on the drug for over 2 years. Then every so often they were giving them this survey of how your cravings are going. This is how they measured it, that little box that you see in the top right. Here are the results. They found that at week 20, so almost a half a year in, they found that the sweet cravings, which had been right at that middle line of 0, they took a huge drop. So a significant reduction in sweet cravings. This is the person who can now sit down in the evening and just be content. They don't feel like they have to eat some ice cream or some cereal or something. But speaking of cereal, being in Canada almost triggers my greatest addiction, which is Shreddies. You guys, we don't have Shreddies in the US, and it's the only reason I'm not a morbidly obese diabetic. When I have Shreddies, I'm like a true addict. I cannot stop. I put a little bit of brown sugar and whole milk. I will eat myself sick on Shreddies. You guys know what I'm talking about? Shreddies? Oh my gosh. That kind of malted flavor, I'm getting triggered. I gotta stop. I need something bitter in my mouth ASAP. I'm gonna go crazy. So they find that their cravings for Shreddies every evening just dropped to nothing. Then they followed them through the rest of the year, and look what happened to the cravings. It was still statistically significant. I would even add meaningful. Still, their cravings were better. But 1 year later, they were right back to where they were. So 2 years on the drug eliminated the benefit, the main benefit being the cravings. Do you remember what I said when I talked about how high insulin causes insulin resistance? Too much of something will start to result in a resistance to that something. Even GLP-1. When the body has been so inundated with this mimicking drug that's mimicking GLP-1, no surprise that it's not going to work very well, or less well. And this is the point where things get very, very tragic, because this is where you have instances of people saying, they're feeling, oh, my cravings are coming back, this isn't working anymore, I'm going to double dose, I'm going to double inject. And this is where people start to have their intestines get paralyzed, and it becomes very, very lethal very quickly. And all of this together gives us this sobering statistic of people just generally getting sick of feeling sick, where the intestines have slowed down. Not to mention, I didn't even show you this. A paper was just published within the last month documenting that the risk of suicidal behavior doubles on these drugs. We already have a mental health crisis. The risk of major depression, I don't mean just I'm not feeling really great, but like major depression more than triples on these drugs. One way, if you'll allow me to be a little unscientific for a moment, of describing these drugs is that yes, as much as it will reduce your cravings for sweets, you may say that it also reduces your cravings for everything. People who used to enjoy going to play pickleball, they don't really want to go anymore. Yeah. They used to enjoy watching action movies, they don't really care. They used to enjoy video games, they don't really care anymore. Everything starts to go a little flat for them. That's a problem. And no surprise then that 70% of people choose to get off the drug on their own. This isn't the clinician telling them to. They need to have a solution when they come off, or even better, a prevention from going on it in the first place. And when people do get off, no surprise, they gain weight back. Now, the generous view, as you look at this figure, would be, your friend would say, well, I'm still 5 kilos less than I was before I started. But do you remember what I said about what they're losing when they're losing weight? What have they gained back? Remember, 60% of the weight people lose on these drugs is from fat. 40% is not fat. Well, one of the quirks of human physiology is muscle and bone has a much harder time coming back than fat does. So even though they're 5 kilos less than they were, they're probably fatter than they were before they ever got on it. So what can you do here? This is the opportunity for you, I believe, as a teacher. My little surrogate students becoming professors in your own right. The body will make its own GLP-1, and there are various things you can eat that help it make more. This was a paper that was just published a few months ago, so appreciate how cutting edge the science is within the realms of unicity. It's only the best for you guys, only the newest data. This paper took people and put them into 2 different groups that varied in the macronutrient composition of the meal. They found that when someone ate a low-fat, high-carb meal, GLP-1 increased compared to a fasted state, but when they ate the exact same number of calories, but it was now higher fat and lower carb, GLP-1 went up over almost 3 times more. That is pretty remarkable, and I would say it's a very relevant thing. This is the way of eating that's going to help them in their brain say, I'm done, I don't need more. Now, what else? How else can someone get some advantage? Well, the products of the Feel Great system also. You could almost say they were designed to improve GLP-1, because if you look at the major chemicals, the major chemical components of these products, each of them is known to directly increase GLP-1. Now, I'm a scientist, and I have for you a new science alert. In fact, this paper was just accepted for publication. So it's not even been released. I literally just got it accepted yesterday. Wow. So this is from my lab. And my students and I were trying to understand how does Unamate, although we had to call it just yerba mate in the title, but we used Unamate in the studies. How does it actually increase GLP-1? First and foremost, we found that Unamate increased GLP-1 by 50%. There are very few things, if anything, you could eat or drink that is capable of that degree of an increase. So a 50% increase over fasted state. Now remember, this is still a fasted state. The person isn't eating calories. This is a non-caloric, non-insulin spiking thing that is eliciting a significant increase in GLP-1. So that's pretty powerful. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, all of these chemical components of Unamate have been shown to increase GLP-1. All of them can increase GLP-1. We wanted to better understand what some of the signals were that allowed it to happen. And the only reason I'm showing you this is to not only show you, I guess, a little more of Unicity's devotion to science, but also ways that it just gives you stuff to talk about. It's interesting, I think, interesting information. So you teach your friend that GLP-1 is made from the L cells of the small intestine. All of these substances have been shown to increase GLP-1. Now, what we found is that if we took whole Unimate and then incubated L cells, like L cells growing in a little petri dish, it didn't result in a significant increase in GLP-1. So the entire kind of raw form of Unimate, that's not what's doing the trick. Now remember, we know there is a trick, if you will. We know that GLP-1 is going up. We just wanted to understand how. So straight Unimate, right incubated on the cells of the intestine that make GLP-1, it didn't do it. There was no significant increase in GLP-1 levels. Then we took one of the most potent parts of Unimate, namely something called ferulic acid. And then we incubated the L cells with ferulic acid, and we found that there was a modest increase. You'd say that was about a 10 to 15% increase in GLP-1 production. However, most people don't appreciate this. You may not know this, but ferulic acid, one of these main components of Unimate, when we eat it, it hits our microbiome, and the microbiome converted into something called dihydroferulic acid. So there's a conversion that happens. Knowing this, we then said, all right, well, what is the effect of this metabolite of the Unimate product? And then all of a sudden, things changed quickly, because now we found that it increased GLP-1 production by almost 3 times. So it suggests that some, at least, of the benefit of Unimate is mediated because of how the guts metabolize it. So there's this activation that happens. Now, all of this is, of course, largely an academic interest. It is published in, it again, is a peer-reviewed publication, just accepted. So you'll see it in print soon enough. But there's one more thing I wanted to mention with regards to ferulic acid. First of all, one thing to appreciate about GLP-1 is, like all hormones in the blood, it has a half-life. There are going to be enzymes that will slowly degrade it. You don't want a hormone to stay elevated all the time. The body needs to be able to turn it up and down. In order to turn it down, there has to be a way to clear the hormone out. GLP-1 is cleared out by the actions of an enzyme called dipeptidylpeptidase, or just DPP. DPP is what it's commonly called, DPP4 to be precise. So GLP-1 will interact with DPP, and then it will get degraded. So if DPP is more active, GLP-1 will be cleared out more quickly. Now, we may not want that, right? Remember, GLP-1 helps us metabolically. It helps us feel a little fuller, in addition to a handful of other effects. But that's the main one. Well, this paper just published, you see, it was just at the end of 2024. So once again, a very recent article. And they found that ferulic acid actually inhibits DPP. So this is an entirely separate mechanism whereby Unimate can be acting in order to increase GLP-1. This could be why we see what we did, which is that GLP-1 levels went up by 50% with Unimate consumption. Again, to put a fine point on it, it could be that other things, but at least ferulic acid, are inhibiting the inhibitor of GLP-1, allowing GLP-1 levels to be higher and to help us feel better. Okay, now, as I go into my final point of being your temporary professor, and thanks again for letting me play this role, it's fun for me, I wanted to just touch a little bit on longevity because I see it really gaining a lot of steam in social media and in bizarre ways, like where you have these biohackers, and I use that term kind of in a derogatory way, who are literally taking blood from their offspring, their children, to live longer, which to me is antithetical to all of creation, where once you have kids, you live for your kid. You don't have kids to help you live. No, they're your motivation. You don't suck their lifeblood from them, literally. But it's turned into a very bizarre field. Although there is a rigorous field of research. And just so you appreciate this, the entire, as I go on a brief tangent, because I'm doing pretty good on time, the entire modern focus on longevity, it was based on the work of a scientist who found, it was a random coincidence that they found that when they were fasting their insects accidentally, they were living longer. They didn't know that they were actually accidentally making their little experimental bugs fast, and they lived longer. And then they found out that if they were turning down the insulin pathway, they made all these various little mutant versions, where they were making less insulin, they were living substantially longer without even having to make them go into a fasted state. That was the beginning of the modern interest in longevity, that until this time, 1993, longevity was just considered a random smattering of genetics and environment. Are you a smoker? Are you drinking? Are you playing in traffic in the night? All these variables that are going to make you not live quite as long. But that was the beginning of people appreciating, oh wait, there are things that directly will impact the body in a hormone-dependent way. Now, the one part of this to focus on is something called autophagy. Have you heard that term before? Autophagy is a term that refers to what the cell is doing. Essentially, when a cell is starting to get old, there may be some part within the cell, like maybe the mitochondria. The mitochondria are getting old and they're producing too much oxidative stress. If a cell is able to activate longevity, it can take that mitochondria and break it down and rebuild it. Or if another part, the lysosome or the endoplasmic reticulum, some other part of the cell is getting old and starting to create a problem within the cell can break it down and rebuild it. That is autophagy. Autophagy is indeed a very relevant part of aging well or longevity research. In other words, we want more. If you have more autophagy, you're generally going to live longer. Now, we have to be careful making those statements with humans because there's no evidence to definitively prove it. But all of the other experimental models with animals, etc., establish that. But there is evidence in humans, as I'll show you in a moment, to support it. Now, your friend is going to say, why are you even talking about autophagy? There's nothing I can do about it. Yes, there is. Autophagy is turned on by the actions of an enzyme called AMPK. And those of you who are going to be at the event in November, get ready to hear me talk more about it. So this is just a teaser, if you will. AMPK is an enzyme that when it's turned on, it will stimulate autophagy. Now, it does a host of other things like telling the body to burn more fat or burn more sugar or make more of the powerhouses of the cell, namely the mitochondria. So AMPK really works in our favor metabolically. And as an interesting point, all of these, every one of these compounds within Unimate and then the short chain fats that you make from balance, all of them directly activate AMPK. So there's a lot to talk about here. Again, the way you talk about it, if you feel like it fits, is that AMPK is this master regulator that turns on fat burning, glucose burning, and yes, even autophagy. AMPK wants to break these things down. Unfortunately, insulin doesn't. When insulin is elevated, it is one of the strongest, most rapid inhibitors of AMPK. Insulin doesn't want to break stuff down. Insulin only wants to store stuff and build things, which isn't bad. But when you're trying to lose weight or you're trying to have a longer, enhanced longevity, you need these periods of AMPK turning on. Unfortunately, again, that doesn't happen because of how people eat. Now, as much as I said that the evidence in humans gets a little difficult, after all, it's hard to follow humans for their entire lifespan, but there is evidence to support this. One of the most compelling studies ever done to measure longevity found that the strongest predictor of who lived long was their insulin sensitivity. And that is, again, important because if you're more insulin sensitive, your insulin levels are generally lower, then there's more AMPK activation, which leads to more autophagy, which leads to longevity. In fact, one of the most world-famous labs is a Canadian lab run by a Dr. Jim Johnson. He has found in his animals, if he just turns down the insulin signal, they will live substantially longer. So even as much as you're focusing on metabolic health and reversing diabetes and weight loss and reducing the risks of dementia and fatty liver disease and hypertension and infertility, you also have something to say just about living a little longer. This idea of the metabolism of longevity. Because the average individual, of course, is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, and the more insulin is elevated, the more AMPK is inhibited, and the more longevity is going to come down. And remember, that matters because for the first time in all of recorded history, we appear to have reached the peak of lifespan, that now generations are turning it down. It's possible that our kids their generation will live less, or will have a shorter lifespan than we do. No parent wants that. And again, you have some tools to help. So all of this wraps up, and here I am finishing up. So here's the average individual. At the very least, you tell them, don't eat between meals. Go on these mini fasts of just 4 hours between meals. And the way I do it personally looks a little something like this. That in a day, if I am going to eat 3 meals, all the more, but even if I'm not, I still do it. This is one way to just, whenever the glucose wants to start climbing, you have a way to address it in ways that I haven't even taken the time to get into, but many of you have heard me speak about before. Both Unimate and Balance, when they're taken with a carbohydrate-heavy meal, will directly bring down the glucose spike of whatever you're eating. So you time this well, and it will work for your advantage. And it's all a result of the chemical components. It's what these products are made with, how they've been designed to help your metabolic health improve. It seems like magic, but it's just really sound science. You guys, thanks so much for listening. I hope you feel great. Thank you.